Hi, I'm Aron Bernstein, and welcome to the Counterpoint module. Simply put, counterpoint, or polyphony, is when you take more than one voice or melody and you figure out how to make them go together and flow together. Now, there are a lot of rules, but we're going to learn them one by one, and it's totally worth it because counterpoint makes all the difference between this and this. So let's get started. We're going to begin our study of counterpoint with a look at the single melodic line, or voice. Here's a melody from one of Beethoven's piano sonatas. You'll first want to notice the melody's contour, or shape, its wave-like rise and fall of notes. Up to the fourth note, our melody has an ascending contour, and then a descending contour for the next few notes. Also, this phrase has two clear peaks, one here and another here. Notice we reach our highest note on the second peak. With plenty of exceptions, most melodies have one climactic point like this, either a highest note or a lowest. Now, melodies can be divided into two categories, conjunct and disjunct. Our Beethoven example here is pretty conjunct, mostly consisting of steps and a few skips. There's only one leap near the end, so its contour is rather smooth. But a disjunct melody has many leaps and has a jagged contour, much like this more famous Beethoven melody. It's mostly leaps this time, and only a couple of steps. So, conjunct melodies and disjunct. Counterpoint, also called voice leading, is the setting of one melodic line against another. And because we want it to be smooth and logical, we'll need melodies that are, for the most part, conjunct. Mostly stepwise motion, very few leaps. In fact, leaps are much more dramatic if they're few and far between. Here's Mozart's Symphony in G minor. It's all steps and repeated notes, except for the giant leap at the end of the first phrase. One last thing about a melody, how to handle a leap. Look at this Mozart example again, and you can see how right after this big leap, the notes double back and start filling in all that space we jumped over. This helps create a cohesive melodic line. You can also see this in the melody from Beethoven's sonata. From the third note to the fourth, we have a skip, but then we immediately change direction, filling in the empty space. The result is a melody that sounds self-contained. If we didn't reverse course after a leap, we might get a melody like this. All that empty space after each leap makes it sound like we have two different melodies here, one low and the other high. Even a really disjunct melody will usually fill in the leaps by reversing course. Okay, with all this in mind, we're ready to look at how melodic voices are set against each other. We're going to use the rules of voice leading inherited from late Renaissance composers like Palestrina and codified by 18th century theorists like Johann Joseph Fuchs. Take care how you pronounce that last name. Let's return to that first Beethoven melody we heard. Now I'll create a second voice to go along with that melody. Look at the first three notes in each voice. Both voices move in the same direction. This is called parallel motion. Now let's go from the third note to the fourth. This time the voices moved in opposite directions, and we call this contrary motion. Finally, let's start on the fifth note. You can see the top voice moved down, but the bottom voice stayed the same. This is oblique motion, one voice moving against another stationary voice. Now that we've seen the three ways these voices can move against each other, we'll want to avoid certain pitfalls. The whole idea of counterpoint is to make the voices sound independent and distinct from each other. For that reason, certain types of parallel motion are to be avoided. Here's our Beethoven melody again, played by a clarinet and a bassoon. Both voices will have exactly the same notes. Listen. The voices move in parallel unisons, and you can hear the effect. It just sounds like a single voice. That's because the unison is the most consonant interval. So parallel unisons destroy the individuality of the voices, and we'll therefore want to avoid them. Next, listen to what happens if the voices play the same notes an octave apart. The effect is almost the same as with parallel unisons. The octave is nearly as consonant as the unison, and so two voices moving in parallel octaves still sound like a single voice. The melody sounds reinforced, but the bassoon part doesn't sound like a separate melody, so parallel octaves should also be avoided. Finally, here's our melody with the voices a perfect fifth apart. This is what you would have heard in medieval church music, when early counterpoint placed two voices a perfect fifth apart. Like the unison and octave, the perfect fifth is a very consonant interval, and two voices moving in parallel fifths are likewise hard to distinguish from each other. The open, mystical quality of parallel fifths worked great for medieval organum, but common practice voice leading treats it as a no-no. Now, while you don't want parallel perfect fifths, it is okay to have parallel motion from a perfect fifth to a diminished fifth, or tritone. You don't want to do it too often, but it is permissible as a last resort. Look at the fourth and fifth notes in each voice. Right now we have parallel perfect fifths, no good. But watch as I make a couple of changes to voice 2. I take away the flat from the B and make the next note a C. Now we go in parallel motion from a perfect fifth to a diminished fifth, and then in contrary motion to a third, which is perfectly fine. So this is allowed, parallel motion from a perfect fifth to a tritone. Just don't have parallel tritones. One last rule, exceptions sometimes apply. Try not to arrive at a unison, octave, or perfect fifth through parallel motion, regardless of the previous interval. Look at the second and third notes. We start on a sixth, and then both voices arrive at a perfect fifth from the same direction. Even though it isn't parallel fifths, this gives a jarring emphasis to that perfect fifth, and at least in this common practice voice leading, we'll want to steer clear. These are called direct fifths, and the same rule generally applies to direct octaves and direct unisons. Now later on, when we have more than two voices, we'll have more leeway when it comes to direct fifths and octaves. In a four-voice texture, inner voices can better hide their effects. However, it's perfectly alright for two voices to approach these intervals through contrary motion, from opposite directions. Here's our first three notes again. This time, we arrive at the perfect fifth from opposite directions. No problem here. That's because with contrary motion, the voices are already more individualized than they would be with parallel motion. So, to recap, parallel fifths, bad. Parallel octaves, even worse. Parallel unisons, direct octaves and fifths, negotiable, but only if you have more than two voices. A final caveat, avoid too much parallel motion. Here's our complete melody again in parallel thirds. Parallel thirds and sixths are fine, but too much parallel motion sounds like we're just doubling our melody rather than making true counterpoint. Now let's end our lesson with my original counterpoint to this Beethoven melody. Notice there's a good combination of parallel and contrary motion, which further helps distinguish the voices. We start with some parallel thirds, then contrary motion out to a sixth, parallel sixths, then oblique motion to a perfect fifth, not the same as direct fifths because one voice is stationary. Remember, the less movement you have, the better. Inward to a third, stay the same, then out to a sixth. Parallel sixths again, then oblique motion to a third, and finally parallel thirds. And throughout the music, you notice we have mostly stepwise motion and a few skips. This makes for smooth voice leading and fewer problems. Something to keep in mind, if you find all these rules of voice leading to be restrictive, you're right, they kind of are. We're learning a very specific 18th century European style of counterpoint. But if the 20th century taught us anything, it's that composers broke those rules right and left, and we will too. We're learning the rules now, so we'll know when to break them later. I'm Aron Bernstein, and stay tuned for the next lesson.